When you look at the infrastructure map of the global AI race, two completely different strategies emerge. On one side of the Pacific, China essentially built a 2,000-mile extension cord to plug its tech hubs into the power-rich interior of the country.
And on the other side, America has the capital, the chips, and the smartest engineers in the world. But when it comes to getting the electrons from the power plant to the data center, America is still arguing in committee meetings about who exactly pays for the outlet.
Welcome back to the Working Thesis. In our first two episodes, we tracked the $2 trillion AI backlog and the massive scale of power generation required to meet it. But generating the power is only half the battle. Today, we look at the delivery mechanism.
Today, we are talking about the grid. Why is it so hard to move electricity across the United States? Why are developers waiting years just for permission to plug in? And what happens when the most advanced digital economy on Earth runs up against an analog bottleneck?
Quick, honest note before we dig in. This is just two curious people thinking out loud, for learning and for fun. It's not investment advice and never a buy or sell call. So always do your own homework. Let's set the stage. As we discussed last time, data centers need power. Lots of it. The logical solution seems simple. Build more power plants. Build wind farms, solar fields, natural gas plants, and nuclear reactors.
The problem is that the places where it is easiest to generate power, windy plains in the Midwest, sunny deserts in the Southwest, are rarely the places where tech companies want to build data centers. Tech companies want to be near fiber optic hubs and their engineers.
So you have a geography problem. You have generation in one place and demand in another. The bridge between the two is transmission, the high-voltage lines that carry electrons across the country. And in the U.S., that bridge is severely congested.
But before we diagnose the congestion, we need to bust a very common myth about the American power grid. If you read tech forums, you will often see people claim that we have plenty of power. We just lose all of it in transmission because the grid is inefficient.
That narrative is only half true. Yes, we struggle to move it, but we do not lose all of it in the wires. In fact, U.S. transmission loses only about 5% of the electricity it carries. That is actually world-class. The physics of our wires are not the problem.
The efficiency of the transmission itself is remarkably good. When an electron actually makes it onto the high-voltage line, it generally gets to where it is going. The problem isn't the wire. The problem is getting permission to get onto the wire in the first place.
The real bottleneck is a bureaucratic traffic jam. If you build a new solar farm today, you can't just throw a rope over the nearest transmission line and start selling electricity. You have to undergo an interconnection study to ensure the grid can handle your power.
And because the grid hasn't been significantly upgraded in decades, the answer is often no. Or rather, the answer is yes, but you have to pay millions of dollars to upgrade the local substation first.
To understand the scale of this traffic jam, we can look at data from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. As of recent tallies, there are roughly 2,300 gigawatts of power projects stuck in interconnection queues waiting for approval to join the grid.
Think about that number. 2,300 gigawatts. That is more than the entire current generating capacity of the United States. There is more power waiting in line to get on the grid than there is currently operating on the grid.
And a massive portion of that is clean energy, wind, solar, and battery storage. The power exists on paper. The capital is there to build it. But the projects are languishing in a bureaucratic purgatory because the transmission infrastructure simply isn't robust enough to absorb them.
It creates a massive chilling effect. If a developer knows they might be stuck in a queue for 3 to 5 years and then face an unpredictable multi-million-dollar upgrade fee, they might just abandon the project entirely. The queue is killing the generation we desperately need for AI.
And let's say you realize the transmission lines are full, so you decide to build a new one. Building a new high-voltage transmission line in the United States requires navigating one of the most complex permitting labyrinths on Earth.
We are talking about a 5 to 10-year permit cycle for a single new line. You have to negotiate with federal agencies, state utility commissions, local counties, tribal governments, and private landowners. And any one of those entities can tie you up in litigation for years.
Because power lines span hundreds of miles, they cross countless jurisdictions. Everyone wants the power, but nobody wants the towering metal lattice in their backyard. The not in my backyard syndrome, or NIMBYism, has essentially paralyzed interstate transmission development.
You can have all the $2 trillion AI backlog demand you want, but if a local county council votes against the zoning permit for a high-voltage tower, the electrons don't move. The physical reality of land rights completely overrides the digital demands of Silicon Valley.
This difficulty is compounded by the fact that the U.S. doesn't actually have a single, unified national grid. We have a highly fragmented system. We have the Eastern interconnection, the Western interconnection, and the Texas grid, ERCOT.
And the connections between those three grids are incredibly weak. We can't easily move excess wind power from Texas to cover a demand spike in Virginia. The grids operate as independent fiefdoms, often with differing regulatory standards and pricing models.
This fragmentation means we have to overbuild generation in every local area to ensure reliability, rather than relying on the geographic diversity of a national grid. It is an incredibly inefficient way to manage the massive, centralized load profiles of AI data centers.
If an AI campus in Ohio suddenly draws a gigawatt of power, the Eastern grid has to absorb that shock locally. It can't call on the sunny deserts of Nevada for help because the physical wires connecting them simply don't have the capacity.
The Department of Energy has looked at this math, looked at the AI load growth, and looked at the clean energy transition, and their National Transmission Needs Study came back with a sobering conclusion.
To meet the anticipated demand and reliability requirements, the United States needs to increase its transmission system capacity by roughly 57% by the year 2035. That means expanding a grid that took a century to build by more than half in just about a decade.
Given the 5 to 10-year permitting cycles and the 2,300 gigawatts stuck in the queue, hitting that 57% target requires a miracle of regulatory reform. It requires Congress, states, and utilities to agree on a streamlined process that currently does not exist.
Until that reform happens, the grid is the hard speed limit for AI in America. You can optimize your transformer models all you want, but you cannot optimize your way out of a saturated transmission wire.
To really understand how structural this problem is, it is helpful to look at how another superpower handles power infrastructure. And to be clear, we are looking at this strictly as an infrastructure observation, not a political take on governance.
Exactly. If we look at China, we see a completely inverted approach to the grid. While the U.S. struggles with fragmentation and local permitting, China has treated electrical transmission as a centralized national security imperative.
The scale of their grid is staggering. Today, China produces roughly 2.3 times the electricity generation of the United States. And because they have a centralized grid authority, they don't face the same jurisdictional infighting when they want to lay new wire.
They recognize the same geographic problem the U.S. has. Their power generation, like hydro and solar, is concentrated in the West, but their tech hubs and population centers are concentrated in the East. Their solution was to build the ultimate extension cord.
They achieved this by mastering a technology called ultra-high voltage, or UHV transmission. These are massive lines capable of moving immense amounts of power over distances exceeding 2,000 kilometers with minimal loss.
China has built dozens of these UHV lines, moving power from the deep interior of the country directly to the coastal megacities. They essentially built a superhighway for electrons, completely bypassing the local bottlenecks that plague the U.S. system.
Meanwhile, the United States has essentially zero modern UHV infrastructure. We are trying to move 21st century data on a 20th century highway system, while watching our primary economic competitor build high-speed rail for their grid.
It means that when a Chinese tech company wants to build a massive new data center, the grid is already there waiting for them. The power has already been routed from 1,000 miles away. They don't have to wait 5 years for an interconnection study.
This sets up a fascinating dynamic in the global AI race. Both the US and China are racing to build the most advanced artificial intelligence, but they are fighting two completely different constraints.
In America, we have the chips. Thanks to export controls and the dominance of companies like NVIDIA and AMD, the US has access to the best silicon on Earth. Our constraint is entirely domestic. It is the power, the grid, and the permitting.
In China, the situation is reversed. They have the power and the grid infrastructure ready to go. Their constraint is the chips. They are battling export controls and trying to build out a domestic semiconductor supply chain to match the West.
So the question of who leads the next decade of AI might not come down to who writes the best code. It might come down to whether America can fix its grid faster than China can figure out how to manufacture cutting-edge 3-nanometer silicon.
For the investors and executives watching that $2 trillion backlog in the US, this grid reality requires a recalibration of timelines. You cannot simply wish transmission lines into existence.
It means we will see more creative, localized solutions. Tech companies will increasingly co-locate right next to nuclear plants or build their own gas-fired generation on site, effectively abandoning the public grid entirely to avoid the queue.
But those are stopgap measures for the biggest players. To truly democratize AI compute and fulfill the broader market demand, the United States has to fundamentally rethink how it permits and builds transmission. The electrons have to move.
The grid is the silent partner in the AI revolution. And right now, that partner is telling the tech industry to slow down and get in line.
So, we know the demand is there. We know the power generation needs to double. And now we know the grid is fundamentally clogged by bureaucracy and fragmentation. But what if you actually get the permit? What if the grid operator says yes?
Well, you still can't turn on the data center. Because even if you fix the grid and get the permit, you're about to hit the most humble, frustrating physical bottleneck in the entire supply chain.
Next time on The Working Thesis, we look at the hardware of the grid itself. We are going to explore why tech billionaires are suddenly obsessed with copper and steel, and why, even with all the money in the world, you might still wait 2.5 years for a single transformer.
The grid is just the highway. You still need the on-ramps. See you in episode 4. And that's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you, genuinely, for spending part of your day thinking this through with us.
The whole idea of this show is pretty simple. We hold a handful of theses about the world, and we test them out loud, together, a little more each day. No crystal balls, just curiosity, and a willingness to be wrong.
So, if that's your kind of thing, stick around for the next one, and tell us where we're getting it wrong. Honestly, the pushback is our favorite part.
Until next time, take care of yourself, and keep asking good questions.